Uh-oh. I just learned I'm being recorded. Okay, I hate that. Okay, but I'll bear with it. Um, our fellow Mississippian Natasha Trethewey is among the most distinguished of contemporary American writers. A Pulitzer Prize winner, she has served as the poet laureate of our nation and our state. Her collections of poetry include domestic work, Bellocq's Ophelia, Native Guard, Thrall, and Monument, poems new and selected. She is also the author of two works of nonfiction, Beyond Katrina and Memorial Drive. We have spent the past 6 weeks discussing her two most recent books, Monument and Memorial Drive, and have to a person been impressed by the power and artistry of both, by the narrative force of her poetry, and by the lyric beauty of her prose. We have been impressed by the tension between form and intense emotion we found in her poetry, a tension that transcends generic boundaries. And we've been impressed by her ability to demonstrate the living nature of memory as it unites, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from Eudora Welty here, as it unites the old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead. We are delighted to welcome Natasha Trethewey to the Welty at Home Book Club. So, welcome, Natasha.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. And hello, all of you. Thank you so much for being here and for spending a couple of weeks reading my books. I thought that I would start today with some poems and then read a little bit from Memorial Drive. One of the things that makes me want to do it like this is that I was actually working on Memorial Drive when I started putting together Monument, which is, of course, my first retrospective. And I think I wouldn't have been able to put it together to order the poems as I did if I hadn't been working on the memoir. And the reason for that is, when you put together a new and selected, even as you are taking poems, some selected poems from each collection, you have to find a new way to order them. And even as they are chronological in terms of books, the poems that I've selected in each book are not in the order that they appeared in the book. And that's because I wanted Monument not simply to be a compilation of all of these, but to actually work as an extended 25th poem, as Robert Frost might have said. So that it is a whole collection and is a new way of looking at my work. And the reason that Memorial Drive helped me was it helped me to sort of structure the book so that a reader could see the reasons that I am a writer, the very reason that I became a writer. I'm going to start, however, not with the very first poem, but I'm going to start with a poem from Native Guard, which is the only collection in here that I have in its entirety. It's a poem that I think is also a kind of autobiography, and one that is sort of structured through the idea of a literary biography, the kinds of books that I read. It's called Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke two laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. So when I was working on Memorial Drive, there was a moment in the midst of writing something that I had to turn the page over and write on the back of it something that was coming out as a poem instead. And that's the poem that became the opening of Monument. It's called Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. And it is a poem that tries to talk back to all of the ridiculous, hurtful things that I've heard over the years that people say who are unaware about domestic violence and how one might find oneself in such a situation. Imperatives for carrying on in the aftermath. Do not hang your head or clench your fists when even your friend, after hearing the story, says, "My mother would never put up with that." Fight the urge to rattle off statistics that, more often, a woman who chooses to leave is then murdered. The 100th time your father says, "But she hated violence. Why would she marry a guy like that?" Don't waste your breath explaining again how abusers wait, are patient, that they don't beat you on the first date, sometimes not even the first few years of a marriage. Keep an impassive face whenever you hear "stand by your man," and let go your rage when you recall those words were advice given your mother. Try to forget the first trial before she was dead, when the charge was only attempted murder. Don't belabor the thinking or the sentence that allowed her ex-husband's release a year later, or the juror who said, "It's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves." Just breathe when, after you read your poems about grief, a woman asks, "Do you think your mother was weak for men?" Learn to ignore subtext. Imagine a thought cloud above your head, dark and heavy, with the words you cannot say. Let silence rain down. Remember, you were told by your famous professor that you should write about something else. Unburden yourself of the death of your mother and just pour your heart out in the poems. Ask yourself what's in your heart, that reliquary, blood locket and seed bed, and contend with what it means. The folk saying you learned from a Korean poet in Seoul, that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest, or like you carry her corpse on your back. Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginnings really helped me figure out my way into writing my own memoir. And if hers began with listening, with hearing her parents call out a song, the notes of a song to each other up and down the stairs, I certainly also began, and some of you will recall this from reading Memorial Drive, listening to my father recite poetry, to the ladies auxiliary group from my grandmother's church as they came over to read the Psalms and discuss scripture, to listening to my Aunt Sugar, the way she kind of sang the Psalms. But also for me, I think there was just as much a beginning in seeing. And I think the seeing, by the time my mother and I were living in Atlanta with her new husband, the seeing had to take over the hearing in many ways. This is called Shooting Wild. At the theater, I learned shooting wild, a movie term that means filming a scene without sound. And I think of being a child, watching my mother, how quiet she'd been, soundless in our house made silent by fear. At first, her gestures were hard to understand, and her hush when my stepfather was near. Then one morning, the imprint of his hand dark on her face, I learned to watch her more, the way her grip tightened on a fork night after night, how a glance held me, the door, a sign that made the need to hear so slight. I can't recall her voice since she's been dead. No sound of her, no words she might have said. This is letter to inmate number 271847, convicted of murder, 1985. When I heard you might get out, I was driving through the Delta, rain pounding my windshield, the sun angled and bright beneath dark clouds, familiar weather, what I'd learned long ago to call the devil beating his wife. I was listening to two things at once, an old song on the radio and on the phone, a woman from victim services, her voice solicitous, slow, as though she were speaking to a child. I was back in the state I still call home, headed south on Highway 49, trying to resurrect my mother in the landscape of childhood as the Temptations were singing her song, the one she'd played over and over our last year in Mississippi, 1971, that summer before we moved to the city that would lead us soon to you. It was just my imagination, and I could see her again, her back to me, swaying over the ironing board, the iron steel plate catching the sun and holding it there. For a moment, I was who I had been before, the joyful daughter of my young mother, until the woman on the phone said your name, telling me I must write the parole board a letter. I was again stepdaughter, daughter of sorrow, daughter of the murdered woman. This is how the past interrupts our lives, all of it entering the same doorway, like the hole in the trunk of my neighbor's tree, at once a natural shelter, haven for small creatures, but also evidence of injury, an entrance for decay. When I saw it, I thought of how, as a child, I'd have chosen it for play, a place to crawl inside and hide. And when I thought of hiding, I could not help but think of you. What does it mean to be safe in the world? Everywhere I go, she is with me, my long dead mother. Is there nowhere I might go and not find you there too? Monument. Today, the ants are busy beside my front steps, weaving in and out of the hill they're building. I watch them emerge and, like everything I've forgotten, disappear into the subterranean, a world made by displacement. In the cemetery last June, I circled, lost, weeds and grass grown up all around, the landscape blurred and waving. At my mother's grave, ants streamed in and out like arteries, a tiny hill rising above her untended plot. Bit by bit, red dirt piled up, spread like a rash on the grass. I watched a long time the ants' determined work, how they brought up soil of which she will be part and piled it before me. Believe me when I say I've tried not to begrudge them their industry, this reminder of what I haven't done. Even now, the mound is a blister on my heart, a red and humming swarm. Memorial Drive begins with a dream. 3 weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense of contentment, as if she's only gone someplace else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which now a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun. Her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I am not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains, her last question to me. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain. That's the dream that animates the very last poem in Monument. And this is an ekphrastic poem, which is a response also to a painting, to Miguel Cabrera's portrait of St. Gertrude, 1763. Articulation. In the legend, St. Gertrude is called to write after seeing in a vision the Sacred Heart of Christ. Cabrera paints her among the instruments of her faith. Quill, inkwell, and open book rings on her fingers like Christ's many wounds, the heart emblazoned on her chest, the holy infant nestled there as if sunk deep in a wound. Against the dark backdrop, her face is a wafer of light. How not to see in the saint's image my mother's last portrait, the dark backdrop, her dress black as a habit, the bright edge of her afro ringing her face with light. And how not to recall her many wounds, ring finger shattered, her ex-husband's bullet finding her temple, lodging where her last thought lodged. 3 weeks gone, my mother came to me in a dream, her body whole again, but for one perfect wound, the singular articulation of all of them, a whole center of her forehead, the size of a wafer, light pouring from it. How then could I not answer her life with mine, she who saved me with hers? And how could I not, bathed in the light of her wound, find my calling there? And I'm going to close now with a very short section from Memorial Drive. Accounting. One day I come home from school giddy with news. It is early evening and the four of us take our seats at the kitchen table. Most days during the week I have practice after school and get home too late for these family dinners. Joel will have already left the house on those nights, so there are blessed stretches of days when I don't see him at all. Tonight, though, I'm too excited to save my news for when I can tell my mother alone. So I blurt it out as soon as we sit down. Not only have I been promoted to editor on the newspaper staff, but also because of a short story I wrote, I've been invited to join Quill and Scroll, the club responsible for putting out the school literary journal. I can see the delight in my mother's face. She is smiling at me, and I am like a daffodil, lifting my face to the sun. I go on about how much I love the short story we are using in English class, how John Updike's A&P is my favorite so far, how I am planning to write a new story for an upcoming issue. I'm going to be a writer, I announce. You're not going to do any of that, Joel says, shrugging his shoulders. He doesn't even look up from his plate when he says it. My mother is seated to my right, and I see her out of the corner of my eye, a deep furrow between her brows, her jaw clenched so tight she seems to speak with her mouth closed. She will do whatever she wants. I am stunned, my head bent now toward my own plate, afraid to look at her or provoke him further by meeting his eyes across the table. For years, she has held her tongue, encouraging me mostly in private so as to avoid his jealous anger. This moment is different, and I know the cost. She's going to be beaten tonight for that, I think. The tone, even inside my head, resigned, matter of fact. The rest of dinner we eat in silence, Joel glowering, my mother in quiet defiance. I am stealing glances at her face, thinking of the bruises she'll wear tomorrow, all the hidden places on her body, soft with pain, calculating the price she'll keep paying to save me. I've replayed this scene in my head countless times. She will do whatever she wants. Even now, I hear in my mother's voice her measured restraint, the origins of my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you for that wonderful portrait of your mother's courage and generosity. And thank you for your courage and generosity in sharing your poems and your memoir with us. It's wonderful to have you here with us. After listening to you, I hate to move to our pedestrian questions perhaps, but hopefully they won't be too pedestrian for you. So let's get started, and I'll ask the first question, and I'll ask Lauren to follow up, and then we'll call on members of our group. So here is my question. In speaking with Georgia Public Broadcasting's Virginia Prescott, you stated, "A poem is generative. It is the greatest act of hope there is in the face of despair." That seems to be true of your memoir as well. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways your work confronts powerful and intersecting reasons for both public and private despair, and yet also finds cause for hope.
That is a great question, Suzanne. Thank you. One of the other roles that poets have is to record the cultural memory of a people. This is a moment when poets are talking about, even in writing about the past, writing about the moments in which we are living. It is a way, as Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. It's one of the reasons that that even in the most intimate, private of poems, there is the public act of speaking, of talking back, of speaking against the erasures of history, all the things that I try to do in my own poems. And I think about Shelley again, who said that poems are records of the best and happiest times in the happiest and best minds. And I think at first that's hard for people to imagine, because if a poem is about, and as you say, a memoir is about something traumatic, it seems to most people on the surface of things that that would be just a sort of a dredging up the trauma, that it is a traumatic thing rather than actually a triumph over despair. But the act of making art in general is the triumph over despair. It says to us, we are still here. I am able to find a way to confront and to contend with what might otherwise seem to be able to destroy me. I had a good friend named Claudia Emerson. Maybe some of you have heard of her. She was a poet, also a Southerner from Virginia. She was the first Southern woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in poetry, and she won the year before I did. She died not too long ago, a few years ago, of cancer, and at the time continued to write poetry. There were, I think, 2 or 3 books of hers that came out posthumously. One of the poems in it was a poem called Remission. And the poem is such an act of hope, because it's as if by writing those words, she could engender the thing she needed. She wasn't able to engender remission, but I can imagine her being filled with hope and still creating something out of the despair of knowing that she was going to die, something that she leaves for us.
Thank you. One of the things that really struck me in Memorial Drive too, along these lines, is at one end of Memorial Drive is your home. At the other end is Stone Mountain. And the one of the great triumphs of the memoir, it seems to me, is bringing together those 2 strands, the public, the social, the cultural problems that we face in this country, and in the personal, and interweaving them. Is that sort of intersection really important to you in your work?
It is. It seems like there's no way that I would have been able to avoid it had I wanted to. And I think that goes back to, of course, the first poem that I read, Miscegenation. Being a daughter of the South, a daughter of Mississippi, born exactly 100 years to the day that Mississippi first celebrated Confederate Memorial Day, imagining my mother, who was on her way to the segregated ward of a hospital to give birth to a biracial child, when it was still illegal for her to be married, rendering me illegitimate in the eyes of the law, to see Confederate flags everywhere, flags that are, and a holiday that was celebrated, commemorated in order to glorify the lost cause and white supremacy, and a group of people who fought to destroy the Union and not preserve it. All of that at the same moment that she knows she's got to get to the hospital to bring me into the world. It seems to me that there was no other way, if one believes in destiny at all, no other direction that I might be able to go in other than looking again and again at the intersections and contentions between our public and private history, our public ceremonies, and what is remembered and what is erased or forgotten or buried or given less attention. With every Confederate monument erected around Mississippi, we are saying this is what is important to remember. And while doing that, we are saying that other things are not important to remember. And so for me, that moment of thinking about structure for Memorial Drive and thinking about the largest monument to the Confederacy, Stone Mountain, rising above the ground with all of its forgetfulness, its amnesia emblazoned on its brow, and my mother's death at the base of it, very small and not the kind of thing that is often rendered important or remembered. What I want to do is switch. I want to switch that. I want to remember, not just for myself, but for all of us, a larger version of our story, our history, because that's what is most significant about America, the larger intersected story of us as a people collectively, not the separate history that is a grand forgetfulness and erasure.
What a wonderful answer, and what a wonderful reason for you to be our poet laureate, speaking for our nation. Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Switching gears a little bit, but still in the vein of remembering and forgetting, is the role of selection and omission, and as you put it, restraint in your writing. Each chapter and memory that you include in Memorial Drive feels so vital, and clearly, you were very selective about what you included and what parts of your life you left out. And the same feels true in your poetry as well. How do you decide what is vital to a poem or a piece of nonfiction? And is it similar or different when you're writing poetry versus memoir?
Thanks, Lauren. That's a good question. When a young writer is first starting out, I see this particularly with my students in a poetry class. One of the first things you learn is that you need details, because details enrich the story. They make it more particular. They make it something that the reader can begin to see and experience, move around inside of. This idea that a poem or a short story is a house that you build that ultimately the reader will inhabit it. So you need to put stuff in it. So people start putting stuff in it. And when they do that, they put in everything. And then sometimes when you start putting in everything, then you go too far. Because if you go too far, what happens is there's a lot of stuff that's simply decorative. It's simply clutter. So how to get what is absolutely essentially necessary for the story that's being told. In a poem, each of the details, and I think this is true for me in writing nonfiction, each of the details ought to be moving the story along, the narrative along in some very particular way that may not be apparent at first to a reader, but should, as any good motif, reemerge in your thinking as you see it later on. And I think about it like this. There's a couple of ways. I remember my father telling me when I was a child, the Chekhovian idea that if, a gun is introduced in one act, it's got to go off by the last one. So you don't want to have details that are simply adornments and not somehow doing some work. And I tell my students that the things, the objects that a poem is made up of, as Frost said, no ideas, but in things. They need to be not only the literal thing that they are, but also carry some figurative possibilities. And when they do both, then you have the right ingredients. If a thing isn't capable of doing both of those things, then it may just be an adornment. It may be one of the things that you can let go.
Thank you so much.
I wish I could be one of your students. Lynn, you have a question about poetry, I think.
I do.
Evans.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for the books and the poetry and your writing in general. We really had a wonderful time. And we discussed your mastery of poetic form more than once while looking at your works. And so I'm asking, how did you mean to make use of a wide variety of poetic forms to capture the essence of what you wanted to say, and also to make triumph over despair?
Lynn, could you say the last part of your question? I think my internet kind of got fuzzy.
I wanted to know how you used a variety of poetic forms to capture the essence of what you wanted to say, as well as to triumph over despair, as you've just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. There is something so empowering and rewarding about that triumph over despair when it is also manifest in a kind of harnessing of form. To be able to take these forms and find a way to make them be the scaffolding for whatever it is that emotionally one must convey. Perhaps you've heard this quote by Audre Lorde, in which she says, "The master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house." I think about that all the time, because the poet Audre Lorde, what she meant in that is something different. What she meant is that the tools of oppression, the tools of erasure, the historical erasure, all of those things, you can't dismantle the master's house by doing the same things. But I like to take that quote and think about it differently, and think about it in terms of forms. A lot of the forms that I write in, these traditional forms, or received forms as we call them, are forms that come down, through empire, from England, the Shakespearean sonnet, for example. So in some ways, because these were invented by masters of the English language, there's a way that they are the master's tools. And nothing feels better to me than finding a way to take those master's tools and mastering them so that they can do the work that I need them to do, whether it be to challenge the master narrative, which I often do, to push back against that kind of historical erasure and amnesia that we are often so guilty of in this country. So that's one of the reasons that I turn to traditional forms. I turn to them also because of the way that the nature of restraint, I think, is embedded already in those forms. Because you are working within a fixed form, there are things you have to do and things you can't do. And when material is particularly difficult, particularly traumatic, particularly perhaps with the potential for being didactic, as opposed to inviting the reader in, I often turn to traditional forms then too, to put that kind of vice grip that heightens the tension in the language and in the music, but also the restraint of what is spoken and what is held back. To apply that to a longer form, to a memoir, for me was to think about it as though I were writing a long poem, to think about using some of the same aspects of traditional forms that I'm most drawn to, repetition and refrain. I make use of that because I also like a story that moves in a non-linear way. Even as I have to advance across time, I also want to circle back, and repetition and refrain allows for that kind of movement, both in a poem, but also in a longer narrative. And it also has everything to do with those kinds of silences, how to make restraint serve what is being uttered, how to make silence amplify what actually is being said. That's what I'm interested in.
Thank you. Harriet, another question about poetry.
Hello, Natasha.
Hi there.
Here's my question. In your poems, you return to photos and paintings to write over them, sort of the way the soldier in Native Guard cross-writes on a field-bound diary, crisscrossing histories. Reading your introduction to the 2019 edition of Welty's photographs, I wondered if your encounter with the 1989 edition in graduate school jump-started your ekphrastic impulse. Was that the beginning of your interest in this poetic strategy?
It absolutely was. It was a fantastic, and I'm glad you brought it up, Harriet, because I'd forgotten to talk about that. But when my stepmother gave me that copy of Welty's photographs and said, you know, why don't you write about some things here? Because I think she knew that I would find something of my own vanished past in those photographs, that I would find a visual articulation of my grandmother's stories about her life growing up in Jim Crow, Mississippi. And so beginning to write about Eudora Welty's photographs, one of the first ones I wrote about, and there's no existing poem now about this, but it was the first one, it might have been the one, no, that wasn't the one on the cover, but there's a woman with a folded newspaper over her head because of the rain. She's sort of keeping her hair from the rain. That was one of the first photographs that I wrote about. And I didn't write exactly about the photograph, but I allowed the photograph to be a window into a memory that I had about getting my hair hot combed as a child. And this was something, sort of a ritual that my cousins would do because they needed to hot comb their hair. I didn't, but I wanted to be part of the community, so I would get my hair hot combed too. But that Welty's photographs gave me a way to see into those kinds of possibilities. Later on, I learned to sort of think like that, or at least it showed me how that was the way that my thinking always worked, very visually, the way that, you know, some people remember or, you know, are moved more by smell or sound. My memory seems to be more visual. And so when I started writing poems, if I could make a photograph of the poem in my head, in my mind's eye, then I knew I could write the poem about it, because that meant I was seeing. It meant I was looking around at the objects in juxtaposition. And so I started reading photographs, Eudora Welty's photographs, and then paintings in the same way, for not only the literal things that are going on, but also the figurative possibilities in the gestures of the people and the objects that you see in juxtaposition.
So I have a second part to that question. It seemed to me that the title poem of Domestic Work is a response to Welty's photographs of Black women, organized in her early collection, One Time, One Place, with the headers Workday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm thinking of your lines, all week she's cleaned someone else's house, but Sunday mornings are hers. Is that connection right? And were there any other of Domestic Work poems that were a response to Welty's photos?
Oh, let me think about that. Well, definitely that connection, because seeing those photographs of women and workers made me think about all the stories that my grandmother had told me when I was growing up about the various jobs that she'd held. And it seemed like that was the way to kind of shape a narrative about a life through the idea of work. And work was so important to my grandmother. She saw it as, well, here we are on Labor Day, thinking about the way that work ennobles us. And so I wanted to capture what was ennobling about the work that my grandmother did. I think I just lost. I'm trying to think if there were other Welty photographs that I made use of.
Well, you don't have to think of them right now.
Yeah.
When you do, I want to know.
Okay.
I wanted to say that more than work, I feel those photographs of Welty's weekend women
Mhm.
who are self-creating themselves and their pleasure.
Right.
I feel that so much in your response too. Yeah.
That's right. When my grandmother's tipping out the door with Dixie Peach in her hair, she's going somewhere to a juke joint on Saturday night. But that sense of self-making, yeah, of joy, but also extreme just dignity. When I wrote the introduction for the most recent one, I didn't know that they were going to use the image that I wrote about on the cover. That just was sort of a happy accident. But seeing that woman on the curb, with somewhere to go, with her gloves, with her pocketbook, reminded me so much of my grandmother. I could see my grandmother in so many of Welty's photographs.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I love that you made me look at that photograph anew. So I thank you for that. Pearl, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha, for all of your work. And you've kind of addressed this already, the beautiful way you wove together your presentation for us today with the poems and with the memoir. But when I was reading Memorial Drive, I was so struck to have poems that I knew from your earlier works come back to me in this other form. So I wondered if you could speak about the relationship of the poems that you had already written, besides Miscegenation, that come up directly in the memoir. For example, Calling, the poem about your mother saving you in the swimming pool.
Yes. Wow. Pearl, thanks for that. It's nice to see you too. And Tom over there. So I really love that you could see that, because there are indeed so many photographs that I have written poems about that I finally write about in Memorial Drive. And one of the first ones was that I wrote as a poem that was in my first book was Family Portrait. It's a sonnet. It is, about the day that the man who is the double amputee comes to take our family portrait in Memorial Drive. It's 1969. My father is back from his Centennial cruise on the ship, a Canadian destroyer. And that is just an image that has stuck with me, which is why it needed its first treatment as a poem, because seeing him scratch that empty place, and to know about phantom ache, to miss something, to still feel so powerfully something that's no longer there. It was a perfect sort of vehicle for that feeling. So it becomes that metaphor of what it is that I will come to long for, to miss, way before I know about it. And I knew when I wrote that poem that it needed more treatment, that moment itself could withstand so much other investigation and articulation. So I write about that scene again, the photograph that was actually taken, that was made. I write about that in my book Thrall, in which my mother is touching me on the shoulder to kind of still me, because I'm sort of twitchy and misbehaving a little bit. So I write about that imprint that she's leaving on me by touching me. And the metaphors there, it had other metaphors that were still, they were still ready for me to unpack those as well. This is why it's so great to write about paintings or photographs, because I don't think that they ever sort of run out. And the poem or the memoir is a record of thought, your thought at the moment. And so by the time I wrote about it again, there was something else I was getting that the photograph was also showing me. And then I write about it one more time in Memorial Drive. The other one, Pearl, you mentioned was Calling. And I think a lot of readers may not see that one as much. So Calling, from my book Thrall, which is, it's a poem about this moment when I am drowning in a pool in Mexico, and my mother is reaching over the edge to save me. So I write about that first in the poem, but of course it becomes a significant metaphor in Memorial Drive. I need that image in Memorial Drive of me looking up at her, her head sort of eclipsing the sun so that you just see that dark ring, her darker face and the ring of light behind it, which becomes the sort of reverse image of seeing her in the dream, first with the hole of light in the center of her forehead, before I look at it so hard that you have that kind of reversal where you see only the light at that moment. It's also an image from my childhood that was just inscribed in my brain in a way that I could not forget. And we all have those. We all have these things that, for whatever reason, come back to us again and again, unbidden. And those are the kinds of things, when an image like that stays with you and returns again and again, I tell my students, those are the ones that you really need to dig into and to unpack and make sense of. And they change over a lifetime, how we interpret them, what they mean. And that's why they continue as images, as metaphors, to keep giving us something.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha.
The memory is a living thing.
Mm-hmm.
Francisca.
Yes, hi, thank you so much again for being with us, Natasha. I'm also asking a question about Memorial Drive. Could one actually say that it is your mother's story that is being written because the two traumas of mother and daughter converge, this is also your word, like a Weltian confluence through the act of your remembering, and like the bodily presence of the two hearts at the very end of your memoir, traumatic memoir becomes embodied and a joint narrative evolves. And this Memorial Drive gives your mother a narrative voice and a very powerful presence. So I think the body, memory, and trauma in a way converge. Would you agree to that?
I absolutely agree with that idea of convergence. And it is certainly, as you say, I think it was the thing that I figured out. It was where the book was leading the whole time. When I first started saying that I was going to write about it, what I wanted to do was just to give my mother this fuller version of herself. My first thought was to research her and her life as if I were researching an historical figure, and to write about her like that. I think I could have spent the rest of my life trying to do that. it wasn't until I realized that the way to tell a story about who she was to tell a story about myself, which is why the epigraphs I chose were so necessary. Shakespeare's "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." I am the walking, breathing embodiment of my mother. But also the idea that the past beats inside me like a second heart. So that, and, all journeys have secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. That destination has always been the destination of convergence. Long before I was aware of it, and found it in the act of writing, such that I needed that last part to remind the reader of that convergence of those hearts together. And I will tell you, because you probably have guessed this about me from reading Memorial Drive, the rational side of my brain and the one that I call the more figurative side, that is willing to visit a clairvoyant and to read numerical signs to try to find meaning. The day that I found out that my former stepfather was being released from prison, in that moment, I had the most profound sense of seeing the world from inside of my mother's body. It was as if I looked at my hands and they were hers, not my own. It didn't last very long, but it was a very odd feeling. That kind of convergence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Beverly, would you like to pose a question?
My question, we read, I've enjoyed this so much, let me say that. Well, we read your introductions to the new editions of both Photographs and One Writer's Beginnings. And in One Writer's Beginnings, you mentioned that you never had the opportunity to meet Miss Welty. So my question was, if you could sit down with her, what questions would you want to ask her, or what would you want to talk about with Eudora Welty if she showed up on your porch?
Well, I'd probably ask her for some advice. I think I'd have some writing questions for her. Mainly, so you have One Writer's Beginnings, and often writers are asked again and again to cover that material, to cover their own beginnings. I have written an essay called "Why I Write" that I wrote maybe in 2008. I wrote and delivered that essay. And I was just beginning to sort of formulate ideas about, why I write. And then, obviously now I have written Memorial Drive, which is very much also about why I write. And now I'm going to do another lecture at Yale that is supposed to result in a small book that will be published, something, like One Writer's Beginnings, on the idea of why I write. And so now I have to do it again. So what I'd like to know from you, Dora, is how you revisit that same thing and find a new way to talk about it. Because the reasons don't exactly change. how I might think about them at a given moment could, but not the reasons. So how to find some other way. And I'm certain that she, must have had to talk about that constantly. Beyond the thing that you've already written, how else do you tell that same story and make it new?
What a happy thought to think of you and Eudora Welty sitting down for a conversation. I'd like to have it here at my house. We could have a nice dinner and I could listen and enjoy it. But we certainly appreciate everything you've done for us today. Your generosity in sharing your poetry and your prose with us, your generosity in answering our questions. Thank you so much. We are ever in your debt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining the conversation today. This will be on the MDAH YouTube page if you'd like to revisit or share the conversation. Thank you again, Natasha Trethewey, for spending this time with us. All right.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks,
Thank
Suzanne.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.